Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's panel entitled Funding the War on Poverty. My name is Bill Frist, and I'll be moderating the panel over the next hour or so, and it'll be an exciting panel, a panel that in many ways will culminate much of the discussion that has gone on over the last 3 days. A real challenge to have such a distinguished panel and a large panel, so I will do my best calling upon some of my experience trying to herd 100 United States senators back in the United States. The premise of this panel is that a substantial increase, a boost in aid flows, improvements in market access, and debt relief on more generous terms, all issues we'll be talking about this afternoon, are needed to create a solid foundation for rapid growth and competitiveness in the developing world. But the overreaching question that we all know is, how do we accomplish this? Should new paths based on close cooperation and shared responsibilities between donor countries and developing nations, as well as private and public sectors, be explored? And if that's the case, and if so, what are the basic principles that should guide our efforts? And how do we guard against the unintended consequences of whatever we choose to do? Joining us today to discuss these issues is a distinguished panel of leaders who are actively engaged in many capacities in the war on poverty, some of them who have very specifically advanced their own proposals to achieve success. Today's panel includes Gordon Brown, Chancellor for the Exchequer of the United Kingdom, President Lula of Brazil, Bill Gates, founder and CEO of Microsoft Corporation, Benjamin Mkapa, President of Tanzania, Jeffrey Sachs, Professor and Director of the Earth Institute at Columbia University, and Domenico Siniscalco, who is a Professor of Economics and, as all of you know, Minister of Economy and Finance of Italy. Today's program panel lists a number of questions. Are recent proposals for innovative sources of financing, such as the International Finance Facility or the Lula Fund, both of which we'll talk about today, viable options? Will improved market access and foreign direct investment eventually replace traditional aid flows and permit a more effective integration of the developing world into the global economy? What steps must be taken so that developing countries could take and should take in order to fully benefit from international trade, opening markets, attracting higher volumes of FDI? Can trade integration help? Well, we have a lot to discuss, and rather than have formal opening statements by the panel, we will keep things informal, and if we have time, we'll be taking questions from the audience as well. I believe I will start with someone who has formally addressed globalization in a commission last year, our good friend President Mkapa, who has studied it, has participated, who sees on the ground both initiatives from the past and initiatives that have been imposed in the future. President Mkapa, if you could just set the stage for us from your perspective, based on your study with globalization, is there a problem out there with current flows of aid that we need to be fixing with any of the proposals that we might talk about over the next hour?
I see. Oh, I see. Okay, fine. Thank you. Speaking from the perspective of a poor, least developed country, a beneficiary of the highly indebted poor countries initiative, the serious problem for countries like ours is that the flow of aid is not in our favor. It's in the favor of the developed, trading, richer countries for two principal reasons. Our trade is basically in commodities, raw commodities, no value added. The prices of those commodities are unstable and unfair. And I see no effort to evolve an international mechanism for fairness and stability on that front. And therefore, those principal assets for us in our war against poverty are virtually negative for that reason. Secondly, in order to achieve even our present level of development, we have had to borrow very heavily, bilaterally between governments and multilateral with international financial institutions. That borrowing exercise was agreed upon on the assumption that there were mutual risks. There were risks to both parties. Now the time to pay back has come. It appears that the risks are not evenly or fairly accepted by the two parties, whether IFs or bilaterals. And therefore, we are bearing the burden of debt service and debt repayment unilaterally. And that is unfair. So on those two fronts, I really believe that the flows are therefore in the opposite direction, not against poverty, but for further enrichment. However minimal that enrichment may be, because our contribution in world trade in Africa certainly is about 2%, in my belief. But nevertheless, its effect is totally deleterious upon our prospects for improving income, or rather fighting income poverty, and certainly giving ourselves, giving governments the empowerment to be effective and to be promotional.
Mr. President, good. Why don't we take several components, and that was a beautiful opening statement for us to play upon. And let me turn to Gordon Brown. We just heard borrowing, time for repayment, debt. Why don't you start with that? Don't jump right into IFF yet. We'll get to that. But go ahead and play off the debt, what we need to do in terms of debt relief as we go forward. How successful have we been to date?
Well, I agree with President Mkapa. The only hope for the future lies in economic development, and that means private sector investment, it means building up the infrastructure, it means the creation of businesses. But we did promise at Monterrey that any country that was making economic reforms, that was opening up with more transparent systems of government, that were tackling corruption, would not be denied the resources they needed for health, education, and for the development of their infrastructure. And this is what the tragedy that President Mkapa is describing is across Africa, that none of the Millennium Development Goals, that is the right to primary education by 2015, a substantial cut in infant mortality, a halving of global poverty, none of these goals on present rates of progress will be met in sub-Saharan Africa by 2015. They will not even be met by 2115 on present rates of progress. They would not be met, in some cases, until 2165. So 150 years is too long to wait for goals agreed in 2000 to be achieved in 2015 to be met. And that's why we must look at the balance between debt relief, support for the development of trade and infrastructure, and finance for development, including health and education. Why debt relief is so important is that President Mkapa's country is spending more on servicing its debts than on its education or on its health. And why debt relief is a problem now is that in the 1990s, we wiped off bilateral debt relief. In other words, the debts owed to America or Britain or Japan or Germany, but we never dealt with multilateral debt relief. So 80% of the debts that are now owed are owed to the multilateral institutions, and unless we find a way through that, then they will never be able, the countries we're talking about, to spend the resources they need either on infrastructure or health and education. So the first proposal for 2005 must be to deal with this historic problem of unpayable debt, the multilateral debt, and that's why we are proposing, and I hope that other countries can support this, 100% debt relief on multilateral debts, IMF debt to be written off by revaluing or dealing with IMF gold through sales, World Bank and African Development Bank debt to be written off by each shareholder of the World Bank taking its share of servicing these debts. And so we would take 10%, other countries would take 5, 10 or 15%. Now that would deal with this historic problem of debt. I do not believe we can make the progress we want in Africa or in the developing countries unless we deal once and for all with this problem of unpayable debt. And I think most people who look at this problem will agree with that. So whatever I say about the International Finance Facility and everything else, debt first, we must deal with that problem.
Let me turn to the other panelists. Well said. So we can keep some order to it. On debt relief, the President stated the problem. Gordon has restated it so eloquently. Any other thoughts in terms of objectives or how the debt relief should be relieved? Yeah, Domenico.
Yeah, thank you very much. I believe this issue of debt relief, which was set forth so authoritatively before, needs now to be addressed on very concrete terms. Next week on the G8 in London, chaired by Gordon, we shall be dealing with this issue, and I believe it is time to basically go with that proposal. The issue has been studied so far. The debt is actually strangling many countries, while for the donors' countries certainly doesn't represent a major problem. So I must say that working on the multilateral line that Gordon was proposing sees Italian government all in favor.
Right,
Let me also add that this is half of the story, however, but because we also need some money up front. I mean, cancelling debt, of course, releases many resources in the country.
I'm going to come right back to you on debt. Jeffrey, do you have anything to add on debt relief? And then I'm going to come right back to Domenico, because that is only the problem. But let's finish on the debt.
I was going to say how wonderful, refreshing, and remarkable it is what the Chancellor said, because what he basically said is, why don't we follow through on what we said we were going to do? And this is really, to me, the essence and the bottom line, the first line of the whole thing. And just in one moment, in 2000, the world said, we'll commit as a partnership to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. In March 2002, the world leaders, President Bush and many other world leaders, got together in Monterey and said, we'll make a framework for doing that. And it's interesting to remember what the framework said. I want to quote just a little bit of it. And I'm quoting, official development assistance plays an essential role as a complement to other sources of financing for development, especially in those countries with the least capacity to attract private direct investment. For many countries in Africa, least developed countries, small island developing states, and landlocked developing countries, official development assistance is the largest source of external financing and is critical to the achievement of the development goals. And then the punchline. We recognize that a substantial increase in ODA and other resources will be required if developing countries are to achieve the goals. In that context, we urge developed countries that have not done so to make concrete efforts toward the target of 0.7% of gross national product as official development assistance to developing countries. It's all there. There's really nothing more to say, except do words mean something? They do, thank goodness, to the United Kingdom with the leadership of the Chancellor, the Prime Minister we heard yesterday. They do to Chancellor Schroeder, we heard today, who was committed to these targets. We heard President Chirac say the same. If all of the world, including the United States, would simply follow through on the words that were stated, we'd achieve these goals. That's all. It's just a matter of following through. The United States, unfortunately, is $55 billion a year short of 0.7 right now. And so the question for us, I believe, is simply, do words and commitments solemnly undertaken mean something for follow-through? If they do, we have little more to discuss because the mechanisms are clear, agreed, committed, and yet the actions somehow slip in between all these solemn commitments and then the follow-through.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Domenico, I cut you off. That is the beginning at step one, you said, and then continue.
Yes, of course, because many developing countries, over and above debt relief, which actually takes away pressure from them, but of course need new and additional resources, upfront money. So that's why, in a sense, facilities such as the IFF and the debt relief happen to be two sides of the same coin. Maybe Gordon will explain better what it is, but we are basically proposing to borrow from future contribution in order to be able to leapfrog, to do the big investment now, and especially in human capital, because there is where the money is needed. So actually, they are not alternative instruments at all, but they are basically two simultaneous steps we must do, and we must do them now, basically.
And I'm going to turn to Bill Gates just to comment on what he's heard so far, and then I would like for President Zula and maybe Gordon to briefly outline what you have both proposed, and then we'll start commenting on this influx of funds. Bill?
Great. Well, I think it's important to think about why is this aid needed? For the world at large, we have 6 billion people, and a lot of those people are either in developed countries or in countries that are on their way to having strong economies. Countries like Brazil, Mexico, Thailand, Malaysia, the level of education, the level of GDP is going up. What we have is countries and parts of countries that you have almost 2 billion of the 6 billion people in, where the level of poverty and bad health and lack of agricultural productivity is such that you can't start this virtuous cycle. And so we need interventions that the longer you wait for those interventions, you don't get that going. And the beauty of this is when you get health, that brings down population growth, that creates more resources for education, and it really is a virtuous cycle. You would have thought that just by solving the diseases in the rich countries, then eventually the medicines would get cheap enough, they'd be available to all the countries. But unfortunately, the diseases that exist are different. For example, malaria is not prevalent in any rich country. That's almost unfortunate because the progress on a vaccine, there would have been a market mechanism and an amazing thing would have happened, and that would have been taken care of. Likewise, the AIDS epidemic is not considered a crisis in rich countries because we have drug therapy to treat people, and so the work on a vaccine has not been as coordinated or as funded as it should be. And so it's to get things going in the appropriate way that we need these funds. Philanthropy is great. I'm certainly excited about what I've been able to do in encouraging other people, but the scale of the problem is such that although philanthropy has an important part to play in risk-taking and showing different kinds of projects, it's governmental scale of money that are going to be necessary to let the entire globe have any level of equity, the health equity, the agricultural productivity that we all think is pretty basic and is encompassed in these Millennium Development Goals. And so if we wait, people are dying. Just the vaccine fund alone, if we could get an extra $4 billion into it, and this IFF we're not talking about yet looks like it has a chance to do that, that would save 5 million lives. And that's one of those sentences that it's hard to be as clear about as you want to be. Because we said we could save one life, let's all, could we raise $1,000 to save one life? Well, that's what we're saying. We're just saying it 5 million times. This is saving lives and creating the virtuous cycle for less than $1,000 per life. And so the ability to follow a proven model, which vaccination is the best there, and get those funds in, it really should be treated as almost an emergency. And that's why the creativity of some approach, like IFF, is, I think, fantastic.
Thank you. Bill, President Lula, you have been active in your own country in terms of social reform and so many issues, I know, with world hunger and famine and Haiti most recently. Could you talk to us a little bit about the Lula Fund? Most people are familiar with it, but comment on the Lula Fund, how assistance would ultimately be distributed as well as the income coming into the fund.
Mais rápido que as campanhas presidenciais no meu país.
People are speaking very fast here. Well, I brought a paper, but I'm not going to read the paper. So to join this debate that's not started by me, by colleagues that are attending this roundtable, well, I think that we are starting a new century. And I also believe that it's necessary above all of us, rulers, businessmen, intellectuals, trade unions, churches, artists, we should stop for a minute and try to think and reflect what happened on the 20th century to see if we're going to do the same things that we did the last century, the past century, or if we're going to use the creativity and intelligence to think to do something new. What I really wanted to say is that in the past century, the distance between the poor countries and the rich countries did not shorten. On the contrary, the gap became larger. Those that were richer became more richer, and those that were poor became even more poor. And there's something that is fundamental that we need to take into account. Even if it's not possible in the trade relations amongst the countries, we managed to convince the rich countries on trade issues to not have subsidies in the products that the poor countries are more competitive. On the other issues, things become even more difficult if we didn't even manage to convince them on trade issues. So the first thing is that we have to establish a policy that we can give conditions to the poor countries for them to produce, especially agricultural products, and to sell these agricultural products in equal terms to the rich countries, and the rich countries could withdraw the subsidies of their agricultural products. This is something that is structural, that is the bottom line, and that can help many poor countries. Second, I believe that it's also very important for us to have the certainty that even in these policies of donors in the past century, it's very dispersed, this policy. It's not homogeneous. There's not a direction, a clear-cut direction. So you lose money. The money goes down the drain. So when we raised the issue, the hunger issue in Davos last year, 2 years ago, in 2003, I believe that we had a relative advance since then. And the major symbol of this advance that we had was the major meeting, the summit meeting that we held of September into the 23rd with 65 heads of state that adhered to the statement. And a statement was made that was supported by 111 countries. I imagine that there's not one sole way for contributing for this issue. The first thing that we have to make it clear, it's that necessary that we should not create a new structure or a new framework to deal with a new fund, because a new structure will spend half of the money of the fund with bureaucracy for the new structure that you're trying to build. We have to utilize already what the existing structures, the UNDP, the United Nations, and ESOC, and so we can build a fund. I propose that we would create a fund due to the fact of taxing arms trade around the world. But it could be a different kind of tax. It could be on taxing financial transactions, or it could be a fund for world trade, or it could be a fund on the money that exists in the tax havens. So something that could be substantially strong, a strong move, something that could be directed to the poor countries, that we would give it to the poorer countries with a multilateral agencies, with the countries coordinating how this money is going to be allocated and applied, allocating it for education, for health care, and also investing in agriculture and microcredits, things that could give us the certainty that 10, 15, 20 years from now, that country that received that fund would not be anymore a country that would need to have aid. Because what happens is that when an important country is willing to build a fund to fight AIDS in any part of the world, but this country, the recipient, has to buy drugs from the country that is financing that program, It's much more to help the labs of that country than to help those that are suffering with AIDS. Things don't work out well. The poor country will continue to see its debt increasing because there's no commitment. We don't see a political will to say hunger is not a problem of those that are in hunger. Hunger is a problem for those that are eating. We're the ones that have to assume the responsibility to extend our hand to those that are not managing to eat. So I didn't want to say that we should have a Lula Fund or a Chirac Fund or a Lagos Fund or Gordon Brown Fund. No, the main doesn't matter. The paternity of the fund, it doesn't matter. What really matters is that we should truly assume the commitment that the money that circulates around the world, a small part of this money that around the world could constitute a major fund so that definitely we can dream that 30, 40 years from now, we will have a world that has more fairness, more equal terms, and more solidarity. This is my dream, this is my wish, and that's why I'm trying to fight for this. I just came from the World Social Forum in Porto Alegre.
I want to hear about thank you very much. We'll come back, and I think what I'll do at this juncture is really play off the funds and specific proposals, other proposals that might come forward, and I think we'll turn to Gordon in terms of I won't call it Gordon's fund, but the international finance facility, and really focus a little bit in terms of both introduction to it and the why and the support that I know you've received for it, in terms of the political, economic, and other requirements that would be tied to receiving that financing as that money is distributed.
Yeah, I think you can talk about a Gates fund because Bill Gates does contribute to it, but a Brown fund, when all of you would have to contribute it, would seem quite unfair. I agree with President Lula that when the subsidies for agricultural protectionism, $300 billion, dwarf the amount of aid, we really have to face up to the problems of agricultural protectionism, and we must do so in the December Hong Kong trade round. And I also agree with them that traditional mechanisms for funding health, education and infrastructure will be quite insufficient to the scale of the problem, the urgency of the challenge, and our own promises, as Jeffrey Sachs has said, to meet the Millennium Development Goals by 2015. Let's be honest, we spend $4 per person in public funds on health in Africa. We spend $1 a week or less on the education of children in Africa. Take Ethiopia, 70 million people, only 2,000 doctors. Take Mozambique, 600,000 people suffering from AIDS, only 6,000 can be helped. And there is no way with traditional funding mechanisms that we can make good the promise that every child be in education and 120 million are not, and that we can reduce infant and maternal mortality. So, what is our proposal? It is not to dismiss the ideas about international taxation. They should be looked at and they should be examined. But there is a problem because in most cases where you apply taxation internationally, if one country or one continent opts out or refuses to join, it undermines the whole scheme, and that's got to be looked at and faced up to. The reason I put forward the International Finance Facility as a mechanism is it can start now, it can deal with urgent problems from now, and it is specifically a temporary facility to deal with meeting the Millennium Development Goals between now and 2015. And basically the proposal is that we use the additional commitments that have been made by countries and more that should come for extra aid. We leverage up that money in international borrowing. For 10 years, we can front-load payments to development aid with a payback period over 30 years. Now, what are the great advantages? First of all, we can provide substantial sums now because they're needed now. Secondly, it gives predictability, stability, and long-term funding for 10 years for developing countries to answer President Mkpa's problem that aid has been too volatile, it doesn't come predictably, and it doesn't come on a long-term basis. Yes, as a result, it can be better coordinated, but the great advantage is that it's front-loaded. Now, this is a proposal that is not too dissimilar from other proposals we had when we had the creation of the World Bank and the IMF. not too dissimilar from what is done with the EIB and the EBRD and other funds in place. But the burden falls not on rising debt repayments by the poorest countries, but on us, the richest countries, agreeing to service the debts of these funds. And I believe it is probably the only way now that we can have a chance of meeting the Millennium Development Goals. So I'm encouraged by the fact that 4 members of the G7, and I applaud President Schroeder of Germany for announcing his support for the International Finance Facility today. Italy, France, Germany and the United Kingdom of the G7 are now supporting this fund. All the emerging market countries, and President Lula has been gracious enough to give support to this facility as well. South Africa, India, China have given support to this, and all the developing countries are in support. And I believe if we could get that level of unity, and the world could work together in this way this year, then this fund could be up and running very quickly. And specifically, Bill Gates has proposed that as a pilot, the vaccination that he has managed to pioneer through the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization should be the test and pilot project for the International Finance Facility. And think of the opportunities. Gavi has immunized 50 million people. It has been the most successful immunization project in history, and it has been done in an anti-bureaucratic way and done by dedicated people using the resources, getting great value for money and being very effective. If we could scale up these resources immediately and raise the extra $4 billion that Bill Gates has talked about, and I believe that is possible with the pledges we are now already getting, then 5 million more children would survive between now and 2015. 5 million lives would be saved. And if we could continue to do it after 2015, 5 million more lives could be saved. So this is not an abstract or theoretical proposition. It could happen now. It could start now. Countries could pledge the money. We could leverage up the money through the borrowing that I propose. Britain has made a contribution. Other countries have announced contributions. And this fund could be started over the next few months. And as Bill has said, what is more important than the saving of a young child's life when we know we have the medical technology and we know if we had the political will, it could be done?
We have, yep. Mr. President, and then I'd like for any of the others on the panel to comment. We've had sort of two proposals that are out there that are not mutually exclusive, but we'd love to have the rest of the panelists comment. Mr. President.
Thank you very much. I don't want to downplay the proposals about new funds. I want to commend and thank heartily Bill Gates here for meeting the promises he makes. He really puts his money where his mouth is. And thank you very much. For me, the problem is not so much the promises. I support all these funds that are being proposed. I support all manner in which these funds will be enlarged. The sourcing I support, whether it is travel tax, whether it is the Tobin tax, you name it. But seeing how countries can't even agree in the European Union about a common agricultural policy, I find it very difficult to think that it will be in the short term possible for them to agree on a common fund very quickly indeed. But while we are working for that goal, there is a fund already we are committed to, and I thank Jeff Sachs. The ODA is a concrete fund for poverty eradication. The ODA is a concrete fund for malaria, TB, and HIV/AIDS fight. What is it that is holding us back from meeting that commitment of 0.7% of GNP? We make annual budgets. Some of them begin in March, others begin in May, mine begins in June. But one common thing is we project where our revenues are going to come from. In my case, when I do that budget, I project how much I will earn for the coming year, and I have to provide there several $million, tens of millions of dollars, in order to pay debt and service existing debt. If we were to cancel that, absolutely automatically, in that 1 year, it gives me that same amount of money to deal with mosquitoes, with mosquito nets, with HIV, care, treatment, testing, you name it. Why don't you do that while you are talking about an additional fund, whether it is the IFFS or the Lula tax or the travel tax or whatever it is? That is, for me, the critical issue. We already have a mechanism for funding the war on poverty. Let's put our money where our mouths are.
Good. Well,
now, for our own, let me say.
Go.
This is. I don't want to be putting to be putting the developed countries on the dock. We also have a task. We also have a challenge, because we also have a capacity, to some extent, of funding the war on poverty ourselves, organizing our economies, organizing our revenue collection systems, organizing our own budgeting, being more accountable and transparent. Those we have we can undertake. A combination of those reforms, I think, would see a tremendous, truly predictable advance in the war against poverty. Thank you very much.
Well said. Beautiful. Gordon, I want you to comment on the first part of his statement, but also in the outflow of funds from the IFF, is it tied to what the President mentioned in terms of reforms or transparency, or as this money flows out? How do you have it tied? And then feel free to comment.
This is simply a fundraising mechanism. The distribution mechanisms are those used by individual countries at the moment with whatever conditionality they have. We want coordination through the International Finance Facility, but it is simply a fundraising facility that is temporary, not an attempt to allocate money with a new international institution to do so. There are institutions like the Global Health Fund, Gavi, the World Bank, and other funds to do so. This is to raise money. Now, the important answer to the President on 0.7, we are committed to 0.7. 5 countries last year committed themselves to 0.7% for the first time as their share of national income in development aid. The problem, however, we've got to face up to is that the timescale it's going to take for all countries to come to 0.7, or even for some of them to get there, is so great now that we will not have the funds now when they're urgently needed now. So the point of the International Finance Facility is to complement countries going to 0.7, to complement a discussion of international taxation, but to get funds urgently moving to deal with the problems we know exist when there are not kids going to school and where there are not the health treatments available. Now, that's why we need both a commitment to 0.7% and the International Finance Facility.
Well said. Let me turn to Bill Gates and then Jeff Sachs. Bill?
Yeah, just real quickly, if whatever IFF funds go to the immunization activity, that's this Gavi vaccine fund, that's one thing. There's a board there that includes UNICEF, WHO, our foundation has a representative there, and they've developed a track record putting together plans with the countries where only if they increase the immunization coverage and add in the new vaccines, which those are the 2 key things that can save the lives, getting full coverage and new vaccines. It's a program that's very easy to measure, not subject to much corruption. A dictator doesn't want a lot of polio vaccine, stockpiled in his basement, so it's not even that attractive. And so when you go for vaccination, that's where the discipline of making sure that the country's fulfilling its part of the bargain comes in.
Good. Jeffrey, then Domenico.
I want to vigorously agree with everybody because they're all stating a part of this truth. President Lula said a small part of international flow should be devoted to this. That's the 0.7, 70 cents out of every $100. That's not a new goal. That's not a UN goal. That's a goal that countries committed to in 1970 to achieve by 1975. They failed. They recommitted in 1992. They failed. They recommitted in 2002. They're going to succeed this time because of Chancellor Gordon Brown and his colleagues. What we have is 5 countries that are there already: Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. 6 more have recently committed with a timetable: the United Kingdom, France, Belgium, Spain, Ireland, and Finland. Germany has said a very strong message that it's getting on board as well. This is a breakthrough that we've had in Davos today. So, small fraction committed. The IFF is a brilliant way to match that commitment with the timing that we need to meet the Millennium Development Goals. It's ingenious, it's practical, it can be done. But let me also agree with President Mkapa. He doesn't want to wait till July 6th when this triumph occurs, which it will, for the IFF. He says, what about now? Well, February 3rd, the G7 finance ministers have the opportunity to cancel President Mkapa's debts, as should have happened a long time ago. They're all correct. The promises are clear, the commitments have been made, and then finally, what Bill Gates said is extraordinarily important, as usual. He pointed out why we have to do this. And it's not just immunization. In agriculture, you can triple African farm yields by getting soil nutrients back into the soil. And if you think that a tyrant isn't going to want to store polio vaccine in his basement, he's not going to want to store manure in his basement either. So let's get fertilizer and trees back onto the soils of Africa, number one. Second, bed nets. Also not so much fun to stockpile in your basement. Bed nets could save more than 1 million lives per year. They are the effective immunization for malaria now, till we have a real immunization. They can save more than 1 million lives. Water. Senator Frist is one of the leaders in the United States on getting water to people that need it. There are wonderful water harvesting techniques for people living in what's called the subhumid tropics to harvest the water so that when the drought comes, they don't die. You also don't stockpile that little pond in your basement. The point is practical means, practical plans, practical timetables, a business orientation like Gavi has, but in agriculture, in health, in water, using the IFF resources backed by the 0.7. It's all there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Let me, Bill, jump in. Go ahead.
Well, we have one problem on this panel. We don't have any anti-aid people.
let me.
How could you oppose this?
Let me say, Jeffrey Domenico, I'll turn to you right now. On the water issue, because it has been discussed at the World Economic Forum, it's been a focus. I do want to keep coming back to that again and again. When we're in a world, especially with a focus on Africa and poverty, where we have 1.2 billion people who are without this safe water that's sitting right here next to me today, when 40% of the world does not have clean sanitation, and we're talking about children and death. We have 10,000 children a day who die every single day, 10,000, because they don't have this clean glass of water. It doesn't have to be this clean. 10,000 die from waterborne illnesses, bacteria, viruses taken in with dehydration, cardiovascular collapse, and early death. 10,000 every day. So I do want to keep coming back to water when I get a chance. All right, Domenico.
Okay, let me just add to the many interesting arguments which were set forward by Gordon and by other people in favor of the IFF. Yet another reason, which is entirely different, maybe a bit cynical, but believe me, absolutely practical. Which in a sense gives an argument in favor of this new instrument vis-à-vis the existing ones. I've been a newcomer as a minister. I was an academic for the rest of in the earliest part of my life. When you go to the experience of writing down a budget into an industrialized country, believe me, is a very difficult bargaining. Okay, they call it pork barrel in the literature. Lot of negotiations overnight, etc., among ministers, interests, electoral interests, etc. This idea of committing the future by signing the IFF, which basically is concentrating over 10 years, 30 years contribution by writing contracts with banks, basically ties politicians' hand, or at least one hand of the politicians, because we tend to take very seriously contracts we write, maybe much more than commitments to the Millennium Goal, etc. So, if we convince our governments to sign this kind of facility, not only we concentrate now the money we need, but also we commit the next 30 years, because the repayment will be a legal obligation then vis-à-vis financial partners we highly respect. So in a sense, the advantage of tying one hand is not negligible, in my opinion, and takes away from the official development the volatility, which, on the contrary, would be typical if we leave it to internal negotiation, different majorities, volatile coalitions, etc. So this extra political argument, in my opinion, is key, at least in a country like my own.
Good. Good. Well said.
Domenico is basically saying you must tie us down because you can't trust politicians.
Yeah.
That's basically the idea.
It's an important argument, but can I just explain why I think front-loading is so necessary at this stage? I mean, the purpose of the International Finance Facility proposal is that money becomes available urgently now to do what needs to be done. And it's because if we invest now, we will save lives and save money for later. And I'm excited by what is possible over the next few years. We've just seen the research trials starting on a malaria preventative vaccine, thanks to Bill Gates and others. But we will need an advance purchase agreement so that these malaria vaccines are available in countries which could not otherwise afford to buy them. Otherwise, the drug will never be produced. There is a possibility of research into preventative HIV/AIDS vaccine. We need an international platform for research into that. But only about £500 million, $700 million or so a year is now spent on research either in public or private sector on that sort of vaccine. And we will need not only an international platform for research that's properly sponsored, we will need also an advance purchase agreement when that vaccine becomes available. And if you take schooling, what could be a better investment than to get more quickly the 120 million children who do not go to school now to school? And every African country I visited in the last 10 days, it is not just the teachers that are demanding that there be education for kids, it is the children themselves are saying, why am I being denied secondary education? And it's parents who are saying, why do I have to pay for secondary education for my child when I only earn £5 a week as a result of the wages I get for a particular job? And so if you look at the arguments for front-loading, they're not just about the usual arguments about infrastructure. It's that we're in a world of great potential where there are medical breakthroughs possible, where education is seen to be the key to economic development in the future. And I tell you, if this generation, with the technology we have, with the science at our disposal, with the knowledge we have of what is going wrong and what is happening every day in Africa and in developing countries, do not act, we do not have a right to be forgiven by future generations.
Mas eu acredito que tem uma unanimidade aqui de que todo mundo tem uma preocupação.
I think that we're unanimous here in the need for support to poor countries. What I'm worried about is what happens when this event is over, when we all go home to their own countries, to their own problems. What's going to happen? I was starting to talk about Porto Alegre because I was just at the World Social Forum in Porto Alegre, and I always believe that it's not just a matter of fighting extreme hunger and poverty, that it would have to become a political problem of concern to the entire world. As long as it's just a social problem, it will be written about by many academicians around the world, discussed by political parties, unions, the churches. But when it becomes a political problem for people, then we're going to sit down and solve it. I say that because yesterday I was at the forum in Porto Alegre, and one of the decisions by the Porto Alegre Steering Committee was that after this forum they're holding now, they will begin to work more closely with multilateral institutions. So those to pressure the institutions to act and to carry through on what we have all agreed to in our agreements and protocols, and very often don't get off the paper because of problems that every country have, domestic political problems. Sometimes a president signs a protocol, loses the elections, and a new one doesn't agree with it and just lets it go. So that's why we need to have a serious multilateral agency that everyone trusts and believes in to be able to work. I believe, for example, that Brazil is canceling the debt. We canceled Bolivia's debt last year to us. We canceled Gabon's debt last year, and Mozambique's debt to Brazil also. we don't have much more to cancel because we don't loan all that much. But those countries were unable to pay us. So it's a canceling something that people would not pay anyway. They had no way, they could not afford it. So if they were paying, and because they were poor, we pardoned them, then what they were paying, they would invest domestically, but they were not paying. So it's a benefit that does not have immediate results for those people that got such benefits. What I believe is that the issue of indebtedness can and must morally and ethically, for example, that the IMF, the poorest countries that are paying, the IMF, instead of taking the money, should make an agreement so that that money be reinvested in education. Make an agreement so that that money be invested in family farming, in domestic research, because that will bring much more benefits to the fund itself. Otherwise, you always have holding the sword over the country's neck, then they will never pay or progress. So unless we make this a political problem, well, I'm optimistic. I think we're going to make tremendous steps to help the poorest countries. In the case of Brazil, Brazil is a poor country. Brazil had everything to be a rich country, but it's not. It's a huge country with extraordinary potential. For 30 years, it's the country that grew the most in the world at high rates. But in Brazil, like in other developing countries, the wealth that was produced was not distributed. It was left in the hands of few. And so we had a huge amount of poverty that we have to solve at some point.
We only have a few more minutes. Let me turn to the audience. And we will try to keep there's a hand up, there are hands there, if we can see where the microphones go. We'll try to keep our answers quick. There is another event scheduled in this room, so we only have, this is more for my panelists, about 5 or 6 minutes before we end. And if you could just identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Sharon Stone. I've really enjoyed being here in Davos. It's very new to me and very moving to me. And I just feel like it's very moving, and it might really amount to something. And I was particularly moved by President Nkapa and by his urgent need of today. So, if you don't mind, I'd like to offer my help and support to you. And I'd like to offer you $10,000 to help buy you some bed nets today. And would, my honor, would anyone else like to be on a team with me and stand up and offer some money and help him as well? 50,000. Thank you. Would anyone else like to stand up and help President Nkapa today?
What? Sharon?
Because we could give this money to the Global Health Fund for AIDS, TB, and malaria. And I think they need some help today. And I would help him today. Would anyone else like to help him today?
You know, we'll have, Sharon, probably a lot of people.
If you would just stand up in the room, and then we don't have to waste a bunch of time, but if you would just all stand up, people will walk around and take your name and help him today. So could you please stand up, and then we'll take other questions.
And if you can't stand up, right afterwards.
Just stand up. Please stand up, because President Nkapa needs help today. So if you could just stand up in the room, if you'll be on a team with me, just stand up in the room if you'll help President Nkapa today, because he needs help today, because people are dying in his country today, and that's not okay with me today. So if you would help children in his country stop dying today, I would really appreciate that, and I think he would too. And this will go to the Global Health Fund for AIDS, malaria, and TB. So just stay standing. Stay standing until someone comes and takes your name, and I'll give the microphone for other questions.
Thank you very much, Sharon Stone. Very well done. All right.
Senator.
Further questions?
Senator.
Let's go. We have time for one more question in the back. We can go in the front row here. Yes. And then I'll come to you, Jeff, right after that.
For Chancellor Brown, on the issue of education in primary schools, the Millennium Goal of universal primary education by 2015 is the world's most pathetic and ambitious goal at the same time. Ambitious because 86 countries are off track. Pathetic because you could not explain to a group of children why you're only seeking universal primary education and only by 2015. But the main money issue is that when a country does everything right, as we know in every country, 85% of the cost are teacher salaries. And what was heard at the UNESCO high-level meeting in Brazil was country after country, Ethiopia, Yemen, Kenya, saying that they could not move forward, even though they had short-term money, because the ministers of finance in their countries understandably said they weren't going to hire 10, 20,000 new teachers without a steady stream. You gave a brilliant speech in Tanzania on this. My question is, do you believe the IFF could deal with the recurrent cost issue of teacher salaries, and is there any other way to reach the goal if it doesn't?
Good. Let me go ahead.
For less than $10 billion a year, every child could be in primary education tomorrow. And that is probably the cheapest and the most cost-effective investment the world could ever make. And that's why the International Finance Facility must have as a central part of it the provision of education. I agree with you that primary education will not be enough. And if in the countries that I visited last week only 10% of children are in secondary education, then there is both a demand for it and a need economically that that move forward. When I met President Mkapa in Tanzania, in Dar es Salaam last week, we were able to sign an agreement for immediate debt relief for Tanzania, and President Mkapa announced that the money would go to secondary education so that children could get into secondary education. And the purpose of the next stages of debt relief agreements would be for secondary education to happen as well as primary education. So it is a $10 billion investment. It is one that could be done easily tomorrow. The IFF is important because it does give the long-term predictable funding that is necessary to make that possible. And I agree that if you're going to plan an education system, you can't plan it over a year or over unpredictable aid. It's got to be planned over at least a decade. And that's what we're talking about with the International Finance Facility. So I think it would be one of the great beneficiaries, but I think secondary education must match primary education in the ambitions that we have in Africa.
We're going to have to close down shortly. Jeffrey, I'm going to turn to you. And because of the overwhelming response, and one of the great things about Davos is that great things occur. But as I keep getting notes here, we are going to have to end, and Jeffrey, I'll turn to you shortly, and then we'll close, with a challenge. And because there are so many people who want to respond, that by this time next year, we need to report back at Davos specifically how many bed nets that participants here at Davos are able to generate. And it really comes from the activity, the spontaneous activity in the audience today. So the challenge that this panel is going to give is to all of you to be able to come back.
Sharon's got $1 million.
Okay. Well, the reports keep getting better and better. How many bed nets will $1 million buy? Sharon's got $1 million already. Well, so our charge is going to be next year at Davos. How many bed nets did we generate over the course of the discussions, which started several days ago and will end here in a few days? But we'll center upon the challenge that Sharon put forward. How many bed nets came out of Davos? We'll report back next year. Jeffrey.
It's amazing what people want to do, and Sharon, it's amazing what you just did. Let's make another pledge, not just to count how many bed nets, but by the time we return in 2 years, that everybody in Africa living in a malaria region is sleeping under a bed net. That's what's going to keep them alive. That's what's going to save 2 million people. That's what's going to save 1 million people a year. Richard Feacham and I, Richard, who's sitting here, you should stand up so everyone knows. Richard heads the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. He does a magnificent job. He and I were just discussing with industry how we can get the 100 million nets done this can be accomplished. And this will be a matter of the IFF and the public contributions and the private contributions. And I do want to say that private leadership like Bill Gates has opened this issue like never before. Tomorrow at 2:30 at the Belvedere, all businesses that would like to participate in the Millennium Development Goals, in whatever way your business can do it, we're going to have a large meeting so that businesses really get involved. Some are supplying products, some are doing it through individual philanthropy, some through corporate philanthropy, some by pairing with universities in Dar es Salaam or other countries, some with technology transfer. If you are interested in being part of what our generation can do, which is to end extreme poverty in our time, please join at 2:30 at the Belvedere.
Okay, Mr. President, and this will be the last word. You are open. You set the stage. We started with debt. We moved through funding mechanisms. We came back to specific interventions. We've seen what spontaneity can accomplish in setting goals. Mr. President, the final word.
Thank you very much. I want to thank my fellow panelists for their very, very persuasive presentations. I hope that the audience has been duly persuaded. But more importantly, I ask them to go back and persuade their governments, their civil society organizations, and the businesses in their countries to rally behind the initiatives that have been adumbrated this evening here. I want to take this opportunity particularly to thank Sharon Stone for her initiative and for the emphasis that she has placed now on the Global Fund, because that is another fund that does not need commencing. It's in operation already. So please fund it. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for a fantastic panel. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Good.